special guest coming to our show to talk about the history of Ryukyu Kingdom. Not many people have heard of Ryukyu, let alone Ryukyu Kingdom. So we have Rob. Welcome, Rob.
Hi, for having me.
So I've discovered you on Twitter because history of Okinawa is one of the things that always fascinate me. But personally, I don't have much background, so it's great to find such an expert on the history of Okinawa, aka Ryukyu. Can you give us like a basic introduction of who you are and how you got interested in the history of Ryukyu Kingdom?
Yeah, so I'm Rob Kajiwara. I am president of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition. My petition to help save Okinawa and to remove the military bases there has over 211,000 signatures on it. I am Okinawan, or as I prefer to say, Luchuan, and I'll explain the difference in a second. But yes, so I am an Okinawan activist. I am one of the leaders of the Luchu, or Okinawan independence movement, to restore our independence. I'm also a historian. I will hopefully finish my dissertation and my PhD either later this year or next year. And my PhD, my dissertation is in Luchu, or Okinawan history. So a lot of people might not be familiar with Okinawa or Luchu. These might be strange terms for you. So basically, Luchu is an island chain in the East China Sea. We're right next to Taiwan, and we're south of Japan. So we're located very close to China. Luchu was an independent country since time immemorial until 1879, when Japan invaded and annexed Luchu against the will of Luchuans. And since then, we have continued to try to restore our independence.
So what's the difference? Sorry for interrupt. So what's the difference between Okinawa and Luchu?
So Luchu is a huge island chain. There's at least 160 different islands in Luchu, 60 of which are inhabited currently. Okinawa is just one of the many islands in Luchu. So that's why we say Luchu is actually the more correct term, because when you say Okinawa, it really only refers to Okinawa Island. It leaves out all the other Luchu islands, and that is sometimes offensive to the people who live on the other Luchu islands. So that's why we say Luchu is actually the more appropriate term. And actually, throughout history, Luchu was the term that most people used. Okinawa, the term Okinawa itself is actually really more of a 20th century construct. It only became in widespread use in the 20th century after Japan and the United States invaded. The term Okinawa is not even a real Okinawan word. In the Okinawan language, we pronounce it Uchina. So Uchina Island is how we refer to Okinawa Island. And so Uchina Island is the largest and most populated island in Luchu, which is why a lot of Westerners tend to be more familiar with that term Okinawa than with the term Luchu. But there are many other islands in Luchu.
You mentioned the native name for Okinawa. So there is a different language being spoken on Okinawa and the whole Luchuan island chain, right? That's different from Japanese.
Yeah, it's an entirely different language group. So Luchu, we actually have 10 different Luchuan languages, according to according to language experts, they have identified at least 10 different Luchuan languages, all of which are mutually unintelligible from each other. So that shows you just how widespread and how really large this island group is. And yes, the Luchuan languages are entirely separate from the Japanese language. Japanese speakers cannot understand the Luchuan languages at all, and vice versa. So the Japan government, though, refuses to acknowledge the Luchuan languages, and instead they consider them to be dialects of Japanese, just like how they considered the Korean language to be a dialect of Japanese when they were occupying Korea. But the United Nations, UNESCO, and most of the rest of the world does acknowledge that the Luchuan languages are in fact a totally different language from Japanese.
So now my audience are American, and they would know Okinawa because U.S. maintain a military base on Okinawa, and they understand the Okinawa through the lens of U.S.-Japan relations. Now, can you give us just the story how Ryukyu or Luchu Okinawa, how we arrive at the present situation? Because as I understand, Luchu have its own long independent history, and has part of its own kingdom. How did it become part of Japan? Can we just go back in time and give the whole, because people don't understand that, and I want people to kind of get that context and the background of really what Luchu Kingdom was.
Yeah. So, since time immemorial, Luchuans have lived in Luchu. According to anthropologists and archaeologists, Luchuans have lived in Luchu for at least 32,000 years. So that's quite a long time. And over that period, we've developed our own unique history, culture, languages, and identity. We had two golden ages in which we really were at the center of international trade throughout East and Southeast Asia. Luchu was a highly respected nation among the family of nations for a long, long time. And then in 1879, after the Meiji Restoration, Japan started to militarize. They started to colonize their neighbors, and Luchu was one of those countries that Japan took over. Of course, Japan did the same to Korea, China, the Philippines, and pretty much all of Southeast Asia and many Pacific islands too. So Luchu, we were definitely not alone in that. However, after World War II, all of those other nations were given back their independence, except for Luchu. Luchu was the only one that was not given its independence back because the United States decided they wanted to keep Luchu for themselves to use for military bases. So between 1945 and 1972, Luchu was under direct U.S. military occupation. In 1972, the U.S. gave, I say that in quotations, they, quote, gave Luchu back to Japan. There was no democratic process, there was no vote, there was no referendum of the Luchuan people in this decision. The U.S. and Japan simply made an agreement between each other to give Luchu back to Japan, and today both the United States and Japan continue to occupy Luchu against the will of Luchuans. And according to international law, this occupation by both countries, the U.S. and Japan, is illegal and a violation of Luchu's sovereignty.
Because U.S. have its largest military presence in Japan, actually stationed on Okinawa, and the reason for that is because the Japanese government didn't want large U.S. military presence on Japanese mainland itself. So they decide, well, we're just going to stick it on Okinawa over the objection of majority population of Okinawa. And that's really, I think, the crux of the issue right now, today. Am I being correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. The Japanese do not want a heavy military presence in Japan. So they simply have dumped most of the military. 70% of Japan's military presence is actually in Okinawa. And Okinawa makes up less than 1% of Japan's total landmass. So you can see it's a huge disparity.
Top of that, Okinawa is an island, and a big chunk of the island real estate is being taken up by the U.S. Marine base, as I understand correctly.
Yeah, that's right. So the U.S. and Japan militaries take up 15% of Okinawa's land and 30% of Okinawa's arable or best lands. So that's a huge chunk of the very best real estate that's being occupied by the military against the will of the Okinawan people.
And what is this new latest controversy about a new U.S. Marine base in Henoko?
Yeah, so Japan and the U.S. decided they were going to build a new military base at a place called Henoko, located on Okinawa Island. The reason for the base, they say anyway, is because they want to move one of the existing bases called Futenma Air Base. They want to move it to Henoko. Now, everyone agrees, all three sides agree, that Futenma Air Base needs to close because it's called the most dangerous military base in the world, and that's the U.S. military's words. Okay, and it's so dangerous because it's located right in the middle of a major city, Ginowan City, population of around 100,000. It's a very dense city. Okinawa is not a huge island. It's not very wide. You could say it's rather skinny. It's a skinny island. So plopping a military base, a huge military base, in the middle of a major city was a terrible idea from the start. And so it causes a ton of problems. It causes environmental problems. It causes noise pollution, which studies have shown it's very detrimental to the health of civilians. It causes crime. It causes accidents. The U.S. military has very frequent accidents on Okinawa, in part because they have military bases in these dense areas. So there's aircraft crashes, aircraft having to have emergency landings, pieces of debris falling off of U.S. military aircraft onto civilians. In some cases, windows from U.S. military aircraft have fallen onto children's schools and daycares and things like that. So you can see it's a huge problem in Okinawa.
Yeah. I mean, we often heard news even in U.S. about the Marine Osprey helicopters crash, and most of the crash happened in Okinawa, right?
Yeah. So Okinawans, we've been fed up with it for a long time, and so for Futenma Air Base, everyone agrees that Futenma Air Base needs to close. So the problem, though, is that Okinawans have been demanding that Futenma Air Base close, and there's no replacement base in Okinawa. You can move it outside of Okinawa if you want. You can put it in Japan. You can put it in the U.S. But don't build a replacement base in Okinawa, is what we're saying, because we already have way too many military bases. But the U.S. and Japan have totally violated the will of the Okinawan people, and they decided they're going to go ahead and build the replacement base at Henoko, Okinawa. Henoko has a coral reef. It's called the second most biodiverse reef in the world, only behind the Great Barrier Reef. It has hundreds of rare and endangered species, including the Okinawa dugong. If this base gets built, much of this coral reef is going to be destroyed. So Okinawans, we are strongly against this military base at Henoko, and we've been peacefully resisting this base for a long time.
We go back even further in history, just to talk about Okinawa and Luchu as an independent identity, an independent kingdom and culture, and how, like, because a lot of people, let alone knowing about Okinawa and Luchu, even less people know about this glorious history of Luchu kingdoms. Can we cover that a little bit?
Yeah, so Luchu is actually very close geographically to China. A lot of people today have this idea that Luchu, because it's occupied by Japan, that it must be really close to Japan, when in actuality, it's closer to China than it is to Japan. So throughout much of history, Luchu has had much closer relations with China than Japan. So Luchu, we've always used our convenient geographical location to conduct a lot of trade and cross-cultural exchange, not only with China and Japan, but with Korea, with the Philippines, with Southeast Asia, with the Pacific, and with many other countries. So this culture of trade and international relations helped turn Luchu into a thriving, prosperous kingdom during the 14th century is when the first Luchu Golden Age started. So
I'm actually surprised when I started to learning about maritime trade in Asia from 14th to 16th century, that how important role that Luchu Kingdom played. It actually basically functioned as a major hub, between trade hub between China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, because its central location. It's very centrally located in between these nations, and on top of that, it has a very special place because it's part of the Chinese tributary system. So, which means it's allowed to trade with China, and because China has such a huge market. And many nations do want to trade with China, but some of them are not being able to because they're not part of the Chinese tributary system. But they could do it through Luchu, so that made Luchu a major trade hub. I was surprised to learn that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Luchuans were skilled sailors, and they were also willing to sail the seas and to facilitate this international trade. Especially back in those days, sailing was not easy. You had to be gone from home for a long time. It was dangerous. There were pirates, and so a lot of countries and a lot of city-states at the time, they just did not really want to be the ones facilitating this trade, even though it was very lucrative for everyone. So Luchuans basically said, well, we'll do it. And so that filled a huge void. And so this was a win-win situation for everyone involved, because that trade was so profitable and lucrative for all sides. So yes, the trade network did extend throughout Southeast Asia and East Asia. So it covered a huge geographical area, but the extended trade network reached even farther. It went as far as Rome. 3rd century Roman coins have been found in Okinawa, coins with the bust of Emperor Constantine on them. So that shows you just how extensive this China and Luchu Southeast Asia trade network really was.
Wow.
And so Luchu was able, as you said, to trade within the Chinese extended trade network. So a lot of people know about the Silk Road, which is very famous. Not as many people are familiar with China's maritime trade network, which was arguably just as lucrative and just as extensive. But for some reason, it just doesn't get quite as much attention as the Silk Road. But it's still very important, especially for East Asian and Southeast Asian countries. And Luchu was really the facilitator in that.
Yeah, in fact, the maritime Silk Road probably carried the most of the bulk of the China trade, just for the simple fact that you can carry more goods on ships than, say, on camel's back. And for for example, I remember a recent Twitter post that got a lot of circulation is about the origin of the word tea. The tea is either tea or chai in most of the world, and it's tea because it basically in a southern Chinese language, Minnan language, the word for tea is pronounced te. So whatever tea that was exported from the province of Fujian left the port of Amoy or Xiamen, went to the rest of the world, and it's known as tea. Whereas the word tea was exported from elsewhere, say from Guangzhou, the Cantonese speaking area, where tea is also chai, or overland from Mandarin speaking area where it's also chai. So other parts of the world half of the world got chai, but what's impressive is half of the world actually known tea as tea. It's the same case in Indonesia, where it's known as teh, and as I understand, Luchu Kingdom have a very special tie, especially with the Fujian province in China, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So Fuzhou, throughout much of history, was the closest major foreign city to Luchu. It's only 836 kilometers away from Naha, which is the largest city in Luchu. So even by ancient standards, that's only a 3 to 5 day voyage, which is very close for both Fuzhou and Luchu. So yes, Fuzhou is a very special city for Luchuans because we've had close and friendly, peaceful relations with Fuzhou since time immemorial. Of course, we've had friendly relations with all of China for a long, long time, but especially the city of Fuzhou.
So how did at one point, the Luchu Kingdom started? Actually, can you talk about how the Luchu Kingdom came about? Let's just bring it all to the way beginning here.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, Luchu is a huge collection of islands, 160 different islands, and although we share a similar culture, the islands, every island, and even different parts within the same island have their own unique subcultures. So for a long time, there was no central governing force throughout all of Luchu. This only happened in the 15th century, the early 15th century, when King Shohashi united the Luchu Islands. And he was recognized by the Emperor of China as the rightful king of the Luchu Kingdom. So this is when the Luchu Kingdom officially started. And this is also the start of the first Luchu Golden Age. Western scholars kind of argue and disagree about when the Luchu Golden Ages actually took place. In my opinion, it actually started at the founding of the Luchu Kingdom by Shohashi.
And the center of the Luchu Kingdom is on Okinawa, right?
Yeah. So Okinawa has basically always served as the central and kind of the central hub for all of Luchu. Like I said, it is the largest and most populated island, and it always has been. And so that's why it tends to get the most attention. During the 14th century, Okinawa Island was actually divided into 3 different rival states called Chuzan, Nanzan, and Hokuzan. So basically, in the southern, the middle, and the northern parts of the island were divided into 3 different kingdoms who they were competitors. They were rivals with each other, and they were all trying to become basically the ruler of Luchu. And so eventually it was Chuzan, the middle kingdom, that won out and became the ruler of all of Luchu under King Shohashi's leadership. And so it was Chuzan that founded the Luchu Kingdom.
But so how then did the Kingdom of Luchu? I'm sorry, that's my puppies. I have 3 of them. And they get excited. They want to be part of the podcast.
Yeah.
So how did the Kingdom of Luchu enter into official relationship with the Chinese dynasties? Because that's also played an important role in the Luchu history, right?
Yeah, it's a hugely important role in Luchu history. We owe so much to China. China really has always treated Luchu very well. They've always treated Luchu with the utmost respect. They've blessed Luchu in so many different ways. They've given us gifts and wealth and technology and other types of assistance. And this, so this formal relationship between China and Luchu goes back to 1372. So this actually predates the Luchu Kingdom. This goes back to when Luchu was in our 3 kingdoms period that I was just talking about. So starting in 1372, all 3 kings of the Chuzan, Hokuzan, and Nanzan sent envoys to the Ming dynasty, to the Ming court, and asked to become tribute states of China. A lot of people have this false idea that China invaded Luchu and forced Luchu to pay tribute, but that's not true at all. It was actually Luchu who requested to become tribute states of China. And they did this because they knew it was so lucrative. They knew that being a tribute state of China was a very good thing. And it was not giving up of Luchu's sovereignty. Luchu was still independent. They were simply part of this wider tributary network of the Chinese. So that term tribute state in the English language, I have a lot of problems with it. It's really misleading because when people hear that term tribute state, they think, oh no, it's colonization, it's imperialism. And for a lot of European countries, yeah, that was true. That was the case. But not with the Chinese tributary network. So starting in 1372, Luchu became actually the first official tribute state of China. And then shortly after, Korea followed suit, and many other nations did the same. Over time, China had many tribute states, but it was really just Korea and Luchu that remained consistent with this tributary relationship throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties.
Yes, one thing people don't realize about the Chinese tributary system, that it's like a highly formalized kind of familial relationship where it's more like the relation between, say, Luchu Kingdom or Korea versus the Chinese dynasty. It's more like rather than say vassals and the overlord. It's more like say like an older brother and a younger brother type of relationship. It's true, it's unequal, but at the same time, it's inclusive. Am I getting that kind of gist correct?
Yeah, that's exactly true. We do say that, just like you said, the relationship between China and Luchu is like older brother, younger brother, or like father and son. So yes, China is, China is the greater nation. However, China also had a ton of respect for Luchu. Um, they never once violated Luchu in any way. They've never invaded Luchu. They've never built a military base in Luchu. They've never harmed us, and in fact, they've done so much good for us. So because China was the greater nation in this relationship, China always had to give more to Luchu than what Luchu gave them. So yes, Luchu paid tribute to China regularly, and this was a lot of tribute. They gave quite a bit. However, China always gave more to Luchu than what Luchu gave to China in order to show their great wealth and generosity, because they were the greater nation in this relationship. It's only natural that they would have to give more. And so Luchu had no problem with this arrangement. Luchuans very much loved this arrangement. Luchuans were more than eager to accept China's generosity. And realistically, Luchu is a small nation. We always have been. We're not trying to be as great a nation as China. China is a huge nation, right? Luchu has never had any ambitions to be as great a nation as China. It's just not realistic for us. All we want are our rights. We want basic human dignity and respect. And that's what China has always provided us.
What people don't realize about the Chinese tributary system is that it's a highly formalized relationship, including trade relationship, and from the China's perspective, a lot of the motivation from the Chinese imperial dynasty is that they did it for the point of prestige. It was prestigious to have these smaller kingdoms and come to court and pay tribute. So the motivation was never about profit, about maintaining a profit from this trade relationship. It was just of these people coming to China and acknowledge the Chinese emperor. So in fact, in the beginning of Ming Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty founder Zhu Yuanzhang actually drawn up a list of 14 countries of whom the China will never invade or conquer, and among them is Korea and Luchu.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The Chinese enjoyed the prestige of having Luchu as a tribute state, and Luchuans enjoyed, the many benefits that came with being a Chinese tribute state. One of those benefits is actually protection. So China was actually obligated to protect Luchu from foreign invasion. And unfortunately, China was unable to come to Luchu's aid, not only once, but twice. The first being in 1609. So during the 1590s, Japan decided they were going to invade China and Korea. And they asked Luchu to join them. And Luchu, of course, said no, because Luchu's friends with both China and Korea, and Luchu has no desire to start a war, of course. So Luchu said no. Japan went ahead and tried to invade China and Korea. They eventually lost. And so instead, they decided to invade Luchu, which they did in 1609. Luchuans asked China for help, but at the time, the Ming Dynasty was in decline, and China was having a lot of problems of their own, and so unfortunately, they were not able to come to Luchu's assistance. Luchuans did put up a good fight, but they were overwhelmed by Japan. Japan, of course, is a much larger country than Luchu, so Luchu lost the invasion, and from that point forward, Luchu was forced at the point of the Japanese swords to pay tribute to Japan. So whereas Luchu willingly paid tribute to China because they loved China, Luchu was forced to pay tribute to Japan against their will, and if they refused, the leaders who refused were executed by the Japanese. So you could see the relationship between Japan and Luchu has always been very unequal. It's been very one-sided, and it's been very harmful for Luchu.
And there's also a very interesting fact. You can confirm whether it's true or not. This is what I read, that after Japan initially subjugated Luchu, they did not want to lose the trade privileges that Luchu have, being a tributary state of China, because Luchu can trade with China freely. So what they try to do is then they try to disguise that fact that they had militarily subjugated Luchu in order that to maintain the special relationship Luchu have with China. So they try to remain in the background, that when the Chinese envoys come, they will try to seclude themselves, so the Chinese imperial envoys were not aware that of the Japanese presence on the island. Now, is that true?
Yes, there's a lot of truth to that. So between 1609 and 1879, Japan did try to very covertly, you could say, take advantage of Luchu. So even after the invasion of 1609, Luchu maintained its independence and continued to be recognized internationally as a thriving and prosperous and independent country. Luchu, there was some, you could say, foul play on the part of the Japanese within Luchu. It's not entirely clear what this relationship was between Luchu and Japan during this period. And scholars are constantly arguing about this, and we're trying to get to the heart of this matter. But the reason for the lack of clarity here is because of the secretive nature of this relationship. You were right in saying that Japan valued having Luchu as a middleman for trade with China. Because Japan refused to join China's tribute system, they refused to acknowledge the Chinese emperor, right? Japan has their own emperor, so they were very proud of that. But at the same time, Japan still wanted to trade with China. Japan really valued Chinese luxury items like porcelain and silk and whatnot. And so they saw Luchu as a convenient middleman. So even though Japan was not allowed to trade with China, Luchu was allowed to trade with China. And so this actually worked out pretty well in Luchu's favor, because during this period, Luchu basically developed a monopoly on the export of Japanese silver. During the 17th and 18th centuries, Japan was in a period of self-imposed isolation, so they did not really want to trade too much with foreigners, but Luchu was an exception. And so Luchu was able to export Japanese silver to countries like China, and in exchange, basically Luchu sold Japanese silver at extremely high profits. So it was extremely profitable for Luchu, and this trade actually helped spark sparked the second Luchu Golden Age, starting in the 18th century and lasting up until 1879.
If I may interject for a second, the silver trade, in large part, is also driven by the high demand for silver in China, because at this time, the late Ming Dynasty China was the world's largest economy, and because the previous imperial government have been printing a lot of paper money, because China was the world's first nation to adopt paper currency, and because the imperial government couldn't resist on printing a lot of paper money, it ended up causing hyperinflation. So people went back to metal currency, which is gold and silver, and mostly silver. And because China is such a large economy, there was a large demand for silver, and that the supply within China weren't able to keep up. Because while China has a lot of gold, it did not have a lot of silver mines. And it's around the same time the silver mine was discovered in Japan. But Japan was not allowed to trade directly with China because there was a problem with the Japanese piracy all along the Chinese coast. And during the Ming Dynasty, it got so bad that the Chinese imperial government just banned trade with Japan totally. So Japan found this loophole through Luchu, to ship its silver via Luchu to China, which it's a very prosperous trade basically for all sides involved, because there's a large demand for silver in China, and they were willing to pay a very high price for those silver. Sorry for that little tangent. Go ahead.
That's good. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, so Japan, at a certain point, before Luchu took over Japan's silver export, Japan realized that they were losing a lot of their silver through exports, through foreign trade, and there was a huge trade imbalance on Japan, for Japan, and that's why Japan basically said, "Hey, we need to stop exporting our silver." But Luchu, because Luchu was the middleman between China and Japan, Luchu told the Japanese and said, "Hey, you really need to continue to give us your silver so we can export it to China and elsewhere, because if you don't, then we won't be able to get you Chinese porcelain and Chinese silk and other Chinese goods anymore." And so Japan eventually said, "Well, yeah, you're right. Okay." So they basically gave Luchu almost exclusive rights to export Japanese silver. So yes, you're right. It was very it was a very lucrative agreement for all three sides, China, Luchu, and Japan.
Okay, then what happened?
Okay, so it really started during the 1850s when American Commodore Matthew C. Perry traveled to Asia. He went to Luchu, he went to Japan, he went elsewhere. And he basically forced the Japanese to end their period of isolation and to open up and to sign treaties with the United States. And so this really shocked Japan, because this foreign power with industrialized ships and industrialized military suddenly forced Japan to end their isolation, and the Japanese obviously saw this as a threat to Japan, and it was a threat. And the Japanese internally went back and forth on, well, what should we do? I mean, should we industrialize? Should we become like the West, or should we continue, to do our own thing? And eventually, the decision to industrialize won, and that's where the Meiji Restoration came in. And with the decision to become like the West, also came the decision to invade other countries, to acquire colonies like the West. And so
Yeah, well,
used.
Japan really took this westernization too hard because at the time there was a theory that basically the world is like a jungle, it's a dog eat dog world. To enable to survive and to thrive, we have to be like the Western imperialist power. You know, they all got rich through overseas colonies, so that Japan must acquire its own overseas colonies. So the closest neighbor just happened to be Korea and Luchu Kingdom.
That's right. And so Japan used their new westernized military to invade both Korea and Luchu. And so between Korea and Luchu, our histories are very similar, right? Because we're both smaller countries wedged in between two larger countries, China and Japan. And for Korea, they were able to eventually reestablish their independence and kick the Japanese out. Unfortunately, Luchu, we have not yet been able to do that, although we are continuing to try.
One thing I want to go back to is even at the time of Commodore Perry's visit to East Asia, including Japan and Luchu, even back then there was a plan for U.S. to establish its forward base in East Asia, and possibly on Luchu. And I remember on twice occasions, the U.S. representative tried to storm the palace on Okinawa, right, to demand audience with the king. Uh, did I remember that correctly?
Yes, that's right. Um, Luchuans did not particularly like Western visitors to Luchu because they were just not familiar with them, right? Whereas we had long established relations with China, with Korea, with Southeast Asia. We had no idea who these Europeans or Americans were. They just suddenly showed up one day, and so when Europeans or Americans came to Luchu and they demanded to see the king or the queen or other officials, Luchuans did not like that too much. Luchuans did not trust these visitors much, and so Luchuans were polite. There was no violence. There was no warfare at the time, but they definitely tried to sidestep the issue and basically hide the king, hide the queen, hide the really important officials of Luchu from the Westerners, and to try to encourage the Westerners to leave as soon as possible.
So they play hide and seek with Commodore Perry. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I like to like for my American audience. The side note is that the reason why America did not continue with their plan for establishing their forward Asian base in Luchu. Or follow up on their opening of Japan after 1854 is, of course, American Civil War that distracted U.S. temporarily from its interest in East Asia, and of course that gives Japan the chance, to do its own expansion, and this actually led to war between China and Japan when Japan first. It tried to invade Korea. Well, not the first time, but again tried to invade Korea. That led to the first Sino-Japanese War. Basically erupted because Japan was trying to expand its overseas empires. And I remember at the time a lot of so let's talk about that. Because the Luchu Kingdom existed as an independent entity up to this time, even though it was forced to pay tribute to Japan. So how did Japan then abolish the Ryukyu Kingdom and establish the prefecture of Okinawa?
Yeah, so similar to what they did to Korea, right? Japan just marched in with their new modern Western military and basically said, well, we're annexing Luchu. And so Luchuans, of course, did ask China for help, but China, again, the Qing dynasty at the time was in decline. China was having a ton of problems of their own, and China was just not able to come to Luchu's assistance, not in a military way anyway. China did try to negotiate on behalf of Luchu, but the negotiations ultimately failed because both China and Luchu were just not in a strong position at the time to fight off.
And this happened around 1870s, right?
Yeah, so 1879 was the official date of the annexation.
Okay. Go ahead, sorry.
So, whereas China did come to Korea's assistance, right? But they were unable to come to Luchu's assistance because whereas Korea is attached to China via land, via the mainland, Luchu is not attached to China. There's the East China Sea in between Luchu and China, and the Chinese Navy was simply not strong enough to match the Japanese Navy, and so that's why China was able to help Korea, even though it ultimately failed, and Korea and China were both eventually invaded by Japan. But that's why China was not able to come to Luchu's military assistance.
Yeah, at late 19th century, China was experiencing serious problems. There was the First and Second Opium War, and then in between there was Taiping Rebellion, and that's just like from 1840s to 1860s. And then after that, there was another large-scale rebellion on its northwest frontier. So there was actually an active debate in 1870s on what do China need? Does it need the land defense or does it need the maritime defense? Should it contribute a limited fund into build a navy or to shore up its land borders? Because at the time there was a large scale rebellion on China's northwest frontier. The whole province of Xinjiang was lost to the rebellion, and at the time there was a big debate in the court, and eventually the court faction that advocated for land defense won, so they got the loans to finance an army to take back Xinjiang, but with the consequence of that is there was no funds to fund a new navy, and so that's unfortunately Kingdom of Luchu bore the consequences.
Yeah. So I just want to add that China did care about Luchu. China cared about all its tribute states. It's just some American and Japanese scholars today, they don't understand the history, the language, or the culture of Luchu very well at all, and so they make these flippant comments saying things like, "Oh, China just didn't care about Luchu. Luchu was just not important to China, and that's why China did not help Luchu," which is not true at all. China did care about Luchu, and they did their best to help. It's just at the time they weren't able to help Luchu militarily because China itself was collapsing and on the verge of being invaded.
And I also remember when later Japan invaded Korea in 1890, sparking the first Sino-Japanese War. At the time, this is just a few years after Japan officially annexed the Luchu Kingdom. Quite a few Luchu independent activists and officials actually fled to Fuzhou on Chinese mainland, and they started like a kind of independence organization there, and they were cheering for China to win the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894. But unfortunately, China lost.
Yeah. Yes. After Japan annexed Luchu in 1879, quite a few Luchuan leaders and independence activists did flee to China. Luchu has had permanent embassies in both Fuzhou and Beijing for many centuries. And so they fled to these two cities, where many of them actually lived out the rest of their lives there, hoping and praying that China one day would be able to be strong enough to help Luchu break free from the Japanese invasion.
That's an important detail because, one of the complaints of the Westerners when they came to China, especially among the British, is that they weren't allowed to have an embassy in Beijing. But, but the Kingdom of Luchu were able to maintain embassy in both Fuzhou and Beijing because Kingdom of Luchu was part of the Chinese tributary system. So they were allowed to maintain their embassies. And British have to wage the Opium War, able to, win that rights to do so.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, the embassy in Fuzhou, the old Luchu embassy in Fuzhou, is still standing to this day. It's actually in very good condition. The Chinese government has preserved it as a museum in order to honor this historic China-Luchu relationship. So that building was actually built in 1474. So wow. You can see it's many centuries old.
Oh, that's on my to-do list when after the Corona crisis is over, when I go visit China again. That's something I like to see.
Yes, I recommend it.
So that will bring us to, can we cover quickly what happened after the Japanese annexation? As I understood, the imperial the royal palace in Okinawa, the Shuri castle, was converted into like a Japanese army barrack, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the 20th century is a very, very sad history for Luchuans. Yes, after the annexation, Japan tried to make many changes to Luchu. Many of these changes were very harmful to Luchuans. So this actually started the Luchu diaspora, where thousands of Luchuans fled overseas to places like China, to Hawaii, to the United States, and elsewhere, South America especially. So this is why there are so many Luchuans living overseas to this day, because of this, because of the Japan invasion. So Japan began their military occupation of Luchu, and it exists to this day. Japan has always built up an inordinate amount of military in Luchu, especially as Japan began to lose the war, World War II. They really increased their military presence on Okinawa Island, planning to sacrifice Okinawans in order to protect Japan. This is why the Battle of Okinawa was so horrific and why there were so many casualties, especially civilian casualties, because of this. The Japanese were really horrible to Okinawan civilians. They committed so many war crimes against us, and they've never really been held accountable for this. Most of the world is not aware of this. They're aware of Japan's other war crimes, but not of their war crimes against Okinawans. It really gets overlooked. So during the Battle of Okinawa, over a 3-month period, between 1/4 to 1/3 of the Okinawan population was murdered, largely by the Japanese. Thousands actually were murdered on purpose by Japanese soldiers. They used the battle as cover to commit genocide against Okinawans. They particularly targeted Okinawan leaders and basically any Okinawan who was caught speaking the Okinawan language, because the Japanese they're still very xenophobic to this day. And so when they would hear Okinawans speaking the Okinawan language, they were like, well, we don't know what they're saying. Let's just shoot them. And they also forced thousands of other Okinawans to commit suicide. This was a very horrific period in Okinawan history. They even used Okinawans as human shields against the American soldiers. So, as I mentioned, between 1/4 to 1/3 of the Okinawan population was murdered during a period that lasted just around 3 months. Somewhere between 144,000 to 200,000 Okinawans. So this is...
In addition to the human toll, there was also untold damage to Okinawa's cultural heritage. The Shuri castle we mentioned was the royal palace of Luchu Kingdom, and the Japanese turned it into a barrack and dug in underground bunkers, which caused the whole compound got bombed and basically obliterated by the American bombing. And in fact, it was rebuilt, I think, only in the 1990s, right?
Yeah, that's right. So Shuri Castle, which is a World Heritage Site, by the way, and many other Okinawan World Heritage Sites and sacred and historic cultural sites were destroyed during this 3-month period by the fighting between two foreign countries, between Japan and the United States. Luchuans had nothing to do with this war. We were innocent bystanders, and Japan and the United States decided to hold their last big battle on Okinawa Island, and Okinawans were the ones to pay the price for that. Yes, after the war, Shuri Castle was actually not immediately rebuilt. It was not considered important, actually, by either Japan or the United States. So actually, sometime after the war, they actually built University of the Ryukyus on top of the rubble of Shuri Castle, which shows you how little respect they had for Shuri Castle. Eventually, the university was moved to its present location, which is around 30 minutes away. And Shuri Castle, as you said, was rebuilt during the 1990s. Finally, it is the pride and joy of all of Luchu. It is one of the most sacred and most recognizable sites in Luchu. Tragically, it burned down again just around October last year, October 2019. It tragically caught fire and burned down again, which is, of course, is another very hard moment for Luchuans, but it, of course, will be rebuilt.
As I recall, that's the Shuri Castle is also the important site for Luchuan cultural activity to present day, right? There's a great enactment of the many ceremonies, right? That happens annually before the fire, of course.
Yeah, that's right. So Shuri Castle is there are constant cultural and historic activities that took place at Shuri Castle before the fire. It will continue again at some point, but one of those major festivals, the ceremonies, is a yearly reenactment of this tributary relationship between China and Luchu. So every year in Naha, they hold a reenactment. It's called the Shuri Castle Festival, but it's a reenactment of when the Chinese ambassador would arrive in Luchu to pay his respects to the king of Luchu. It's a huge ceremony. It consists of a parade that runs through downtown Naha, and it climaxes with the ceremony that takes place in the courtyard of Shuri Castle. There's hundreds of participants and thousands of spectators, including visitors, including tourists, who are just fascinated by this reenactment. So you can see that even to this day, Luchuans remember the history, the long history of friendship and mutual cooperation between China and Luchu.
Speaking of which, have you watched that 1993 NHK drama series called the Wind of Luchu? So I guess in Japanese will be the Kaze no Ryukyu, Dragon Spirit.
Yes, but Luchuans are not too happy with that drama because they really did not do a good job with that. It was Japanese people trying to make a drama about Luchu, and so it was not very accurate historically or culturally, or linguistically for that matter. So Luchuans were really not too happy. Well, we're really not happy at all with the way Japanese media has portrayed Luchu. So what we're doing is we're calling for the creation of Luchuan media. We're calling for Luchuans to regain control of our own narrative. And so we're actually in the process of working on different film projects and film and TV and music and drama about Luchu, done by Luchuans, created by Luchuans and for Luchuans, and for the rest of the world to enjoy as well. But you see, so we don't want Japanese or Americans to continue to speak for or over us. We want Luchuans to speak about Luchu.
I remember, so I watched that's why I wanted your take on that TV series, because I only saw the beginning of that drama, which has the Chinese imperial envoy arriving on Okinawa, and as the two envoys were walking by, they noticed there's some Japanese people on the island, and they were talking among themselves like, why are there Japanese people on Luchu? And I thought that was hilarious.
Japan is notoriously bad at misrepresenting Luchu. In fact, even just last year, for the NHK Taiga drama, it wasn't specifically about Luchu, but it partially was. So the drama last year took place partially on Amami Island, which is one of the northernmost Luchu islands. So it is part of Luchu. So again, they continue to just abuse and appropriate Luchuan culture and history. And again, they did a bad job of that. And so Luchuans, quite a few were complaining about it. Quite a few were saying, "Oh, we just can't watch this. It's just so bad. They're just desecrating us. They're desecrating history." And this was just last year.
Speaking of film and media representation, I just like to point out that one of the most popular actor in Chinese film industry and media is Takeshi Kenishiro, who a lot of people understood in China as a Taiwanese Japanese actor, but in fact that I believe his heritage is Luchu, right? He's a Luchuan, right?
Yeah.
Well, his father is.
Yeah, so he's Chinese Luchuan, so half Chinese, half Luchuan. Yeah, he's actually not Japanese. I'm not sure how he personally identifies, but technically he is Luchuan and not Japanese.
Yes, because I thought because in Chinese media a lot of time many people kind of accepted the Japanese narrative that Okinawa is part of Japan. That sometimes just gloss over, and he became known as a Chinese Japanese person. But when I look on his heritage, I'm like, wait a minute, this guy, his father is from Luchu, like a tradition, like a native Luchuan family, not a Japanese settlers at all.
Yeah, and so Kaneshiro is a very common Luchuan last name. So the name itself, any Luchu would recognize that name as a authentically and not a Japanese name.
For Chinese audience who may be more familiar with him, with the Chinese pronunciation of his name, the actor we're talking about, of course, is Jin Chengwu. The Japanese pronunciation of his name is Takeshi Kaneshiro. So moving on, after Battle of Okinawa. Basically, what happened was that the whole entire Luchu Island chain basically came under U.S. occupation, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I do have to clarify, though, that during the 1850s, when Commodore Perry visited the islands, even though Luchuans really were not too thrilled about him and tried to prevent him from seeing the king and so forth, Luchu did sign treaties with the U.S., basically treaties of trade and commerce. So this is important because it shows that the U.S. and other countries recognize Luchu as a sovereign, independent country. So Luchu also had treaties with the Netherlands, with Britain, and with other countries. But yes, Luchu did sign a treaty with the U.S. So after World War II, when the U.S. decided to keep the Luchu Islands for themselves, this was actually a violation of America's own treaty with Luchu, because once you sign a treaty with the country, you cannot just invade and occupy that country. That is a violation of international law. So, according to international law, even to this day, Luchu is legally still an independent country. Now, of course, in all practical sense, right, de facto, Luchu's de facto independence is gone, right? At least not. Our de facto independence is not currently there, right? Because we are under both U.S. and Japanese control. But international law does side with Luchu. It does mandate that Luchu's independence must be restored.
What happened in 1970s? Like, what was the decision make? What drove U.S. basically to give, quote unquote, back to Japan, give a Luchu Island chain back to Japan?
So basically, Luchuans were never happy with the U.S. occupation of Luchu. Luchuans never wanted America to stay there. And throughout the entire U.S. occupation, Luchuans have always resented the U.S. and have always resisted the U.S. So this sort of came to a high point during the Koza riots. Koza is currently part of Okinawa City. It's a very large city, basically in the middle of Okinawa Island. And of course, Koza and Okinawa City does have a heavy military presence there as well. So basically, throughout the 60s, especially during the late 60s and early 70s, there was a ton of anti-U.S. sentiment. This was a high point in anti-U.S. sentiment in Okinawa. And the Koza riots, well, basically, a bunch of Okinawans were fed up with the U.S. and they rioted against the U.S. And so at this point, the U.S. realized they have to do something. They can't continue to maintain the status quo because it's just not tenable. So what the U.S. should have done is restore Luchu's independence, because that's the only right thing to do. It's morally the right thing to do, but it's also legally under international law the right thing to do. Of course, they did not do that. Instead, they came up with an agreement between the U.S. and Japan that excluded Luchu entirely. Luchu is not part of this agreement. So the U.S. decided to, quote, give Luchu to Japan so that between the United States, they could both occupy Luchu and continue to control and maintain a large military presence in Luchu.
I just like to add that even the legal basis for Luchu's independence was actually laid out in the document that Japan signed at the end of World War II Japanese surrender. Japan was supposed to give up claims on all territories it acquired through military means. So that included, Korea, Taiwan, all the islands in Southeast Asia. And this would actually imply that the Luchu island chain should be part of the territory that Japan have given up as World War II.
Yes, that's exactly right. There's something called the Trust Territories of the Pacific. These were Pacific islands that had been taken over by Japan. So after the war, the United Nations made a list of these islands and basically began the process of restoring independence to these island nations. Luchu should have been on that list, but they were not, because at the time they were under U.S. occupation. So you see, both the U.S. and Japan are continuing, they just continue to assert the rights, the democratic rights of Luchuans. Now, I should mention that during the 60s and 70s, there were some Luchuans who favored a return to Japan because they thought, well, being part of Japan would be better than being part of the U.S. military, because as a U.S. military colony, Luchu had no rights. They had no democratic rights. It was a military rule. So some Luchuans thought, well, it can't get much worse. We might as well, it would be better for us to be part of Japan than to continue to be ruled by the U.S. military. But now, looking back on it, those same Luchuans are saying, yeah, that was a mistake, because it's more of the same. Because both Japan and the U.S. don't respect us at all. They continue to violate our rights, our basic human rights. So even though it's been several decades since the U.S. gave Luchu to Japan, and pretty much all Luchuans agree, the vast majority of Luchuans anyway, agree that this has not been a good thing for Luchu. This has been more of the same. It's been bad. Not that Luchuans, I mean, want to be part of the United States or anything like that, but we're saying, rule by both the U.S. and Japan has been bad. And so this is why myself and my colleagues and my organization, this is why we're pushing. We're saying we have to restore our independence. That's really the only way we can survive into the 21st and 22nd centuries, is by restoring our independence. Because if we continue to allow the U.S. and Japan to just destroy Luchu, eventually we're not going to have anything left.
You know, there are some people who say, "Oh, what is Okinawa going to do if it's independent nation? It's no, it depends on largesse and the funds coming from, you know, basically occupation by U.S. and Japanese military." So I just like to point out that the central location of the Luchu Islands, you know, in the middle way between Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, it means it could actually reprise its historical role as a trade hub. You know, like right now, there's already like Okinawa already function as somewhat of a mini trade hub for you know, for air flights between China, Japan, Korea, etc. I mean, with evacuation of U.S. from large piece of prime real estate on Okinawa Island, you know, Okinawa people can actually do more with that.
Yes, you're exactly right. So there's a huge misconception that the Okinawan economy is dependent on the military. This is simply not true at all. So as I mentioned, the military takes up 15% of Okinawa's land, 30% of Okinawa's arable land, but it contributes just 5% to Okinawa's economy. So you can see that the military presence in Okinawa is actually running at a huge economic deficit. It's a huge burden on the Okinawan economy. So, as I talked about earlier, before 1879, before Japan and the U.S. invaded, Luchu was a prosperous country. It was highly respected. In fact, European visitors to Luchu were astonished at the quality of Luchu civilization. They were amazed because Luchu had virtually no poverty, no crime, no warfare. Everyone was happy and healthy and thriving. And they went back to Europe and they told stories about this country named Luchu and about this virtual utopia that Luchuans had. And even some European leaders like Napoleon Bonaparte, even he was amazed at the quality of Luchu. So before Japan and the U.S. invaded, Luchu was a wealthy country, and we can be wealthy again. We just need to get Japan and the U.S. out. We need to reassert our democratic right to independence. And as you said, we're going to use our geographical location to resume our historic trade, our international trade. We want to again become a world leader in trade and diplomacy, and also finance and education. And so we have a bright future as an independent country. So I've actually put together an economic plan to revive Luchu and to once again make Luchu a world economic leader once we regain our independence.
I also like to remind people that even up to this day, Okinawa is famed for having being a land of longevity, of many people living way past 100 years of age, and just because the healthier lifestyle on the island.
Yeah, that's right. Luchu, even dating back to ancient times, Luchu was famous for our health, for our longevity. Even the ancient Qin and Han dynasty emperors were fascinated with this. They actually sent search parties out to Luchu to try to discover or to try to find the elixir of immortality from Luchu and to bring it back to China so that the emperors could live forever. That's how famous Luchu was and always has been for our longevity.
Yeah. Unfortunately, nobody told the emperors that what they actually have to do just to move to Luchu.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's
So
not
it's
portable.
yeah. So a lot of it is lifestyle. Luchuans remain active. Uh, we say it's kind of a joke, but also kind of true. We say that the retirement age in Luchu is 97. Uh, because 97 is a very auspicious year for Luchuans. It's basically the start of the second childhood, as we call it. So Luchuans will continue to work, particularly as farmers, um, well into their old age, and that's a large part of how Luchuans remain healthy for so long. Now, I do have to say though that because of the Japanese and U.S. occupation of Luchu longevity is starting to wane. It's starting to get shorter because we don't have access to our lands. We can't grow the foods that the healthy foods that we've eaten for hundreds or thousands of years anymore. We have to rely on Western style junk food, on fast food and things like that. And so the longevity is starting to weaken. But once we return our independence, we can once again grow our own crops and make Luchu once again self-sustainable in terms of all essential items like food and healthcare and water and things like that. And then use international trade for all non-essential, for not all, but a lot of non-essential items, luxury items. So in the course of this coronavirus pandemic that we're currently in, this is particularly relevant, right? Because all of a sudden, the international trade routes have been disrupted. All of a sudden, globalization doesn't quite look as good as it used to in the Western sense, anyway. And so, a lot of countries all over the world are thinking, well, we need to revamp, we need to rethink our economies, because in a crisis like this, when the trade routes are disrupted, we have to be self-sustainable. We have to grow our own food and our own energy and whatever other essential items we need. And Luchu was self-sustaining up until Japan invaded. So we can once again become self-sustaining.
Many of my audience have interest in martial arts, so I guess we have to talk about karate because it originated in Okinawa. Is it possible for you to go into the history of karate a little bit?
Yeah. So karate, the name karate actually is a Japanese word. In the Okinawan language, we actually call it ti. It's just called ti, which means open hand. So the meaning is still the same as karate, which also in Japanese means open hand. But you see the word and the pronunciation is really different. So yes, ti is an original, authentic Luchuan form of martial arts. It dates back to ancient times. It has received a lot of influences from Chinese kung fu, especially Shaolin style kung fu. But Luchuans have modified it and adapted it to our own unique needs. And so after Japan invaded, they basically stole tea from us. They renamed it karate, and they exported it to Japan and then to the rest of the world. That's why a lot of people actually think that karate is Japanese when it's not Japanese at all. It's 100% Luchuan.
And for people who might not be aware, the Shaolin is actually a series of temples with its main temple in the north, but there is a southern Shaolin branch that's based in the province of Fujian. And because of the traditional long historical ties between Luchu Kingdom and Fujian province, that the southern style of Shaolin got exported and exerted a lot of influence on the formation of karate or T.
Yeah, yeah. So Shaolin Kung Fu and philosophy has really been very influential on Luchu T, and so much so that one of the major branches of Luchu T is called Shaolin Lu, which literally means Shaolin, which literally means Luchu style Shaolin. So you see the influences there, and that's actually the school that I was taught. Don't get me wrong, I'm not particularly good at but yes, I have been taught some, and I continue to practice.
Oh, nice. Oh, this has been a fascinating talk with you on the general history of Luchu Kingdom, its modern development. Is there anything else you would like to cover on our show?
Well, if anyone is interested in more information or in ways you might be able to help us restore Luchuan rights and independence, you can check out our website, peaceforokinawa.org.
And people, please follow Rob on Twitter because he tweets out some very fascinating historical pieces about Okinawa and the Luchu Kingdom. Where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, my handle is at Rob Kajiwara. That's Rob, Kajiwara. Also, my contact info is on our website, peaceforokinawa.org. And we really want to make Luchu. We want to make Luchu once again a country of peace and prosperity in the Asia Pacific region. It would really help, I think, serve as a mediator between these larger world powers, so that hopefully we can avoid another war in the future.
Now, I have a question. How strong do you say is the Okinawan independence movement, both inside Okinawa and abroad?
So generally, around 1/3 of the population or so supports independence. However, a poll that was conducted a couple years ago indicated that more than 50% of the population is not satisfied with the status quo. More than 50% are not satisfied with being with continuing to be a prefecture of Japan, because it just hasn't worked out for us. We don't have our rights. So I would say there is support for independence among Luchuans. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that Japan oppresses people who support Luchu independence. Japan regularly harasses us. They actually they kind of what's the word, blacklist. They blacklist Luchuans who support independence. So they basically put a mark on your government records indicating that they call you an activist, and that makes it harder for Luchuans to get into schools or apply for jobs or access government services and things like that. So also, Japanese police, if they consider you an activist, they will stalk you, they will harass you, They've harassed me quite a bit, and my colleagues are as well. And so you can see they are actively trying to discourage Luchuans from supporting independence. So that's why actually a lot of Luchuans are afraid to support independence. I think a lot more Luchuans actually secretly or privately support independence, but they're just too afraid to admit it because of the oppression from Japan.
Yeah, that's the one thing about public opinion. You could change in a short amount of time because look at the Scottish National Party. They have grown a lot more in the more recent years, and but there has been a long persistent campaign and movement against a U.S. military presence on the island, right? I understand there's a lot of organized protest against the construction of the new U.S. Marine base. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so although support for independence might be kind of mixed, around 80% or so of Luchuans strongly agree that the military presence in Luchu is bad. So around 80% of Luchuans oppose the U.S. The heavy military presence in Okinawa. So, in my opinion, resisting the U.S. and Japanese military is actually part of the Okinawan identity. It's really part of who we are. It's very widespread. Even people who might not necessarily support independence generally agree that this heavy amount of military presence is ridiculous. It's got to stop. It is prejudice. It is discrimination.
And also it literally brings physical harm to many Okinawan civilian population because I remember when I first came to the United States in 1990, that's when I started reading about all these rape cases committed by U.S. Marine in Okinawa, and these U.S. Marine rapists, they were not fall under the jurisdiction. They're not subjected to the laws in Okinawa or Japan. They only get prosecuted by U.S. military if they so choose. Right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. The U.S. military does create. They commit a lot of crimes in Luchu, and especially when you consider the context that Luchu was historically a very peaceful country with very little crime. For foreigners, for a foreign military to come to Luchu and steal our land and then commit crimes against Luchuans, including raping Luchuan women and girls, young schoolgirls, okay, are raped and murdered by U.S. soldiers. And this happens all too often. So this is part of why Luchuans are fed up. And even when Luchuan men try to protect the women from the U.S. soldiers, the U.S. soldiers in some cases have actually attacked and even killed Luchuan men for getting in their way. So you can see that the military presence in Luchu has been extremely harmful for Luchuans.
And what's the current situation about prosecution of U.S. soldiers who commit crimes on Okinawa? Are they still can they now be prosecuted under the Japanese law, or they're still only subjugated, only answerable to U.S. U.S. Military laws?
It's really not clear. Japan. So as you mentioned previously, yes, you were correct in saying that for a long time, U.S. soldiers were not subject to Japanese law, which means they could commit crimes and get away with it. And in many cases, they did. The U.S. military often did not prosecute them. They simply took them back to the U.S. They took them out of Okinawa and brought them back to the U.S. And in many cases, they were let completely off the hook. So it has improved a little bit recently. Japan has managed to assert some amount of law against U.S. military members who commit crimes. However, this is still not. It's not nearly enough. It's a lot of it is really up to the U.S. military still, and they are really the ones who get to decide. Well, should we allow this soldier to be tried in Japan or not? So, the credit for improving the situation, even if it's only a slight improvement, the credit really belongs to the Okinawans, who, especially the elderly Okinawans, who have worked for decades to improve the situation. This did not magically happen on its own. This was not a result of U.S. generosity. It was not a result of the Japan government intervening, for the most part, anyway. Although there are some Japanese lawmakers who have contributed positively to the movement, but for the most part, this was a result of the elderly Okinawans who have been working so hard for so many decades to improve the situation in Okinawa.
For one last point I want to make is that, there are many people I have seen making the point that U.S. presence in East Asia is benign because U.S. military safeguards the safety and the prosperity of East Asia. This is not the case. This is definitely not the case on Okinawa. U.S. military presence does not make people on Okinawa safer in any means. The amount of the U.S. military station in Korea, in Okinawa, they're not even there to supposedly defend, right, against what they call the Chinese aggression, because it's actually official policy to have these military presence there as so-called the tripwire. So in case to maintain a U.S. military presence there, in case there was an attack, now that's actually a excuse for U.S. to enter into war. So actually, they are meant to be targets. The U.S. military base in both Korea and Okinawa, they're meant to be a sort of a target base. Like in case these bases get attacked, then U.S. can form a more muscular response. And so in effect, they're not actually making people of Okinawa safe.
Yeah, that's right. They're not making us safer. They're actually putting us in harm's way. They make us a target of attack from America's enemies. So again, we have no part in this. Okay, we're a small and peaceful people. We have no issues with China or North Korea, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, we're actually friends with both China and Korea. We always have been, and we always will be. So the U.S. and Japanese military presence in Okinawa is harmful for us. It does make us a target. It puts us in danger. I talked earlier about the battle for Okinawa and how devastating it was for us. With modern warfare, though, another war or battle could be so much worse. As bad as the Battle of Okinawa was, if something were to happen today or in the future, it could be so much worse. One nuclear missile launched against a U.S. base in Okinawa could easily kill more Okinawan civilians than who were killed during the Battle of Okinawa. We could easily be wiped out with one nuclear missile.
And people nowadays, all these armchair generals, talk about limited war in East Asia. That's just not feasible. We're in a nuclear age now. There's no any kind of hot military action will lead to a nuclear exchange probably in 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, this people thinking that the war is still doable among great powers in 2020. They're either insane or they're liars. They do it for other purposes, like getting more defense fundings. Because this is not going to happen. And I believe it's Einstein who said that he doesn't know how World War III is going to be conducted, but World War IV will definitely be conducted with rocks and sticks, and that's the truth. And
yeah. So as we say in Okinawa, the U.S. military presence in Okinawa does not. They're not here to protect us from the invaders. They are the invaders. Americans like to consider themselves as the heroes, but that's just not how we Okinawans see them.
This has been a very fascinating talk. We're going up to a 1 minute and 50 mark. Is there any other topic that you would like to talk about, Rob?
I mean, I think we covered a lot. Again, I just want to stress that we desire peace and friendship with both China and Korea. We certainly have no issues with them. We want to resume our historic relationship or friendship with both countries, and we just don't see that as possible with the continued U.S. and Japanese military occupation of Luchu.
I mean, basically, right now, U.S. forcibly tie Okinawa on its war wagon, and it's really not. It's a fact that's not welcomed by the Okinawa people. I mean, and I'm surprised, how little media attention this is getting in the Western press. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but it's really a travesty and shame that this fact is being kind of well hidden away from the public eyes for so many years.
Yeah, if China were the ones building a military base in Okinawa, the U.S. media would be all over this story. But because it's the U.S. and Japan who are building the base, the U.S. mainstream media virtually ignores it.
Yes, because it's assumed whatever U.S. is doing is a norm, and that is normal state of affair. And as we all know, nowadays most of the media pieces are nothing but the rags for maintenance of the empire and U.S. hegemony anyway. It has been a very fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Rob, for coming to the show to talk to us about the history of Okinawa and Luchu Islands. We hope to have you back on the show in the future to talk about your activism and whatever other project you have been involved with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To subscribe, search in Google the Silk and Steel podcast. The Patreon link should be the second one from the top. Or you can go to patreon.com. In the search box, type in Silk. The Silk and Steel podcast should be the first one in the result. I put in a lot of time and effort to put together this podcast, and I do ask you for your support. For $5 a month, you will receive premium patron-only episodes like this that details culture, politics, history of China, its surrounding region, and China's relationship with the world. You will also receive pre-released regular episodes before they have been released to the general public, as well as newsletters detailing everything China-related topics. I hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you subscribe. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Yurohara so